Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our final webinar in our 2022 Regional Reflections on Green Infrastructure and Nature-Based Solutions series. Today, we're thrilled to be featuring green infrastructure projects from the West Coast and Pacific Northwest. I'm Rebecca Eicher, a project director with the American Association for the Advancement of Science's Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues, also known as the AAAS EPI Center. The AAAS EPI Center's mission is to bring clear, concise, and actionable scientific evidence to decision makers. We're honored to be co-hosting this conversation about green infrastructure and nature-based solutions in partnership with our colleagues from the US EPA Office of Water, the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative, and the White House. This discussion is an opportunity to hear about successes, challenges, and the opportunities from the design and planning phases to implementation, to operations and maintenance of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions along the West Coast and in the Pacific Northwest region. We have a wonderful set of speakers today, and I'm happy to introduce one of our partners, Clark Wilson from the US EPA Office of Water. Clark Wilson and Robin DeYoung have been crucial to the success of this webinar series, and we are extremely grateful for their partnership. Clark is going to tell us a bit about the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative. So welcome, Clark.
Thank you, Rebecca. And hard to believe that's the end of our series. This has been a great series. Really happy to have the collaboration with AAAS EPI Center. And as Rebecca said, I just wanted to give a brief introduction about the Federal Collaborative. The Collaborative is a community of practice comprising over about a dozen federal agencies who all kind of work in the same space around green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. The Collaborative members work closely together to share and align knowledge and resources to help communities build capacity and maximize the environmental, economic, and social benefits of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And as of late, the Collaborative has been seeking to facilitate strategies and using green infrastructure and nature-based solutions for more climate resiliency purposes, and also to encourage the equitable implementation of green infrastructure for all. So I'm going to put a link in the chat box to the Collaborative's webpage, where you'll see a lot of the past webinars that we've hosted and some more information. So thank you very much for attending. And again, thank you, AAAS, for partnering with us.
Great, thank you, Clark. So before we move on to our presentations and the Q&A, I just wanted to do a bit on logistics. We encourage you to use the chat. So please introduce yourselves, share your ideas, resources, and experiences. Additionally, we have the Q&A box available, so please put your questions for the presenters in the Q&A box. We want this discussion to be interactive, so we encourage you to ask questions, share ideas, and again, take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and organization. We do hope to get to as many questions as possible, but we can't promise we will get to all the questions. Please do reach out to us at the AAAS EPI Center with any follow-up questions. For those of you attending this webinar live, you will receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording and a saved version of the chat via email. Our speakers' bios, a copy of their slides, and a recording of today's webinar will be available on the AAAS EPI Center webpage, usually a couple days after the webinar. We're delighted to have our speakers and all of you join us today. So first, I'll start with Nick Kinsman. We're honored to have Dr. Nick Kinsman, co-lead of the Coastal Resilience Interagency Working Group, which is part of the White House, here to share about the working group's efforts and the White House interest in nature-based solutions. Dr. Kinsman is a coastal scientist with experience in flood and erosion management, ocean observing, and geodetic positioning. Welcome, Dr. Kinsman.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you again for continuing to host this fantastic series. I know how much work goes into it, and it's been fun to watch it progress around the country. I'm personally based in Anchorage, Alaska, so it's nice to see more and more names that I recognize in the resilience community pop up on the chat, and I'll be watching the Q&A. and the chat after I speak and provide these remarks at the start here to answer any follow-up questions. So I do want to say on behalf of the White House Coastal Resilience Interagency Working Group just how great it is to be here and for AAAS and EPA to be hosting this terrific webinar series. In terms of framing the importance, I know that everyone on this call is aware of the important role that nature-based solutions play in our nation's approach to resilience. President Biden, in his first week in the office, introduced Executive Order 1408 on tackling the climate crisis, recognizing that addressing climate change requires a whole of government approach. The executive order established the Domestic Climate Policy Office, an entirely new office, and the National Climate Task Force, which is made up of cabinet members and different executive offices of the president in the leadership roles. The executive order itself focuses on decarbonizing and transitioning to a clean energy economy with use of electric vehicles, offshore wind, solar storage, that sort of thing. But it also places an equal emphasis on resilience through nature and conservation. This is the first time we've seen this at this level. It includes initiatives such as America the Beautiful, which commits to conserve 30% of the landmass and 30% of the ocean by 2030. Climate smart agriculture and forestry, the creation of a civilian climate corps focused on nature and helping nature to serve its natural role in curbing the climate crisis. In response to this executive order, 5 interagency working groups were formed to focus on extreme heat, flooding, drought, wildfire, and coastal resilience. The White House also recognizes throughout this process the very important role of engaging with the public, like all of you, in taking these next steps. David Hayes, the former Special Assistant to the President for Climate Policy, helped to kick off this webinar series, and we've been participating every step of the way. I'd personally like to thank David for his leadership and his service to the administration. He's moved on to new things, but we're looking forward to continuing to advance many of his initiatives moving forward. The Coastal Resilience Interagency Working Group itself is co-led by National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the White House Council on Environmental Quality. We recognize that at the coast, the impacts of climate change and more frequent and severe and extreme weather events, sea level change, erosion, and other stressors are challenging and in some cases devastating coastal economies, our infrastructure, and also the resources that our economy depends on. We want to just take a moment for a second and acknowledge and recognize the devastating impacts that coastal hazards have had on our country and coastal communities in the last couple of weeks. From Alaska to Puerto Rico, Florida, and the Southeast Atlantic coast, we have seen devastating impacts that are affecting our communities. And I know on a personal note, I've been incredibly involved in the response and recovery activities up here in Alaska, and just seeing everyone commit and bring their whole selves to making sure that we're thinking about not only ensuring safety of life and property now, but how we can start to think strategically about making sure that these things are better protected for the future. This is all reaffirming the importance of the work that we do. The challenges that we're facing really do require strategic investments in mitigation and recovery measures that can account not just for conditions as they are today, but for changing conditions in the future. There's been a lot of early recognition in one-on-one conversations with leadership from each of the agencies that are involved in the Coastal Resilience Interagency Working Group that nature-based solutions have a vital role to play in advancing our coastal resilience and our resilience at large. An early product that the group generated, the Interagency Working Group, was a compendium of federal nature-based resources for coastal communities, states, tribes, and territories. It's currently being updated to include recent agency publications and increases to funding that are available from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think there's a link that can be provided in the chat that will take you to the Interagency Working Group's webpage. And there's also a link to that resource guide. I want to just say a huge thanks to everyone that contributed to that early effort in the development of that resource guide. It's being used as a template to build out tools and resources for other nature-based solutions work in the interagency space. So many of you on this call may have even contributed directly to its development, and it's being used widely across the nation. We understand that these solutions don't only protect our environment and critical marine ecosystems by reducing flooding, moderating extreme heat, improving water quality and biodiversity, but they also, when strategically employed, can pay dividends on the resilience front. And projects like oyster reefs can provide co-benefits that bolster our economy as well. I do want to highlight the novel nature-based solutions that are already on the ground in Washington State. and are becoming more widely utilized across the Pacific Northwest. There's projects like the North Cove Dynamic Revetment, and I think there's a link to a resource that can be shared out as well on that project, which was done in partnership with local nonprofits, citizen groups, private landowners, public utilities, state agencies like the Washington Department of Ecology, and federal agencies like NOAA. Projects like this aim to prevent coastal erosion and combat coastal flooding and sea level rise by utilizing natural materials and harnessing the power of wave energy to redistribute materials across the beach and help rebuild beach and dune ecosystems. And they also showcase the power of leveraging all of the different ways that different partners can contribute and nimbly adapt when working together on projects like this. So I love seeing the collaborations that are showcased in projects like that one. Another example from where I work is a project that was funded by the National Coastal Resilience Fund in 2019 that supported the construction of a storm surge berm between Shaktoolik, a community on our western coastline, and the Bering Sea. It used 100% nature-based local materials, restoring coastal dune habitat. At the time, the project was intended to prevent the destruction of the community and avoid contaminating marine habitat in coastal wetlands and rivers with fuel and other hazardous biological waste. That project was constructed and it served its purpose. When the storm hit a few weeks ago, the berm was entirely destroyed, but it also protected the homes behind it. We have direct reports from local residents saying that because that berm was there, their homes, their property, and potentially lives were saved. Agencies and states, locals, territorial and tribal governments have an unprecedented opportunity right now to make investments with funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law includes over $50 billion to support climate resilience at the coast and beyond. And with the signing of the Inflation Reduction Act, there's an additional $3.3 billion that can support communities in their preparation, adaptation, and resilience to weather and climate impacts at the coast. A really exciting part of the language in these laws is that for the first time ever, it supports the use of nature-based solutions in a multitude of different programs. It calls it out by name. So our nation's at a point in time where we now have the resources to bring our minds together to think big and develop proof of concept projects that can really showcase the value of these approaches. On Earth Day this year, President Biden issued an executive order that specifically called out the importance of developing nature-based solutions as part of our approach to tackling the climate change. I think that executive order announcement is something that can be shared in the chat as well. I encourage you to take a look at it. It talks about how a brand new subgroup on nature-based solutions is coming together to submit a report to the National Climate Task Force to identify opportunities for greater deployment of nature-based solutions across the entire federal government, including through potential policy guidance and program challenges. And this is really exciting. We have different parts of the White House co-leading this effort together and bringing in experts from across our nation to think about how to reduce barriers to the adoption and use of these solutions. They are developing a report on opportunities to accelerate nature-based solutions for climate progress, ecosystems, equity, and prosperity. And Clark, thanks for mentioning the equity piece because it is so critical to this conversation. That report is planned for release later this year, so please keep your eyes open for it. The Biden-Harris administration also announced last week new actions by 20 agencies to bolster the federal government's resilience to climate impacts. If you could share that last link I had out, there's a great summary in there. And you'll see also, again, the call out on the utilization of nature-based solutions across a variety of federal facilities to improve coastal resilience. And so in that way, we are showcasing in our own investments in our facilities at federal agencies, how we can lead the way. We are so excited to have all of you helping to advance these communities of practice and thinking about this. And I cannot wait to participate in the rest of this presentation today. And this series has been fantastic, learning about nature-based solutions as they appear in all of their unique different ways around the country and recognizing how those variations really help us to embrace the natural resilience of our landscape and how that can help us become more resilient in turn. So with that, I do want to make sure that the links were provided and just say thank you so much again for the invitation to come and speak. I'm talking to you from the perspective of the Coastal Resilience Interagency Working Group, but nature-based solutions really are cross-cutting across all the resilience spaces. And so I'm so looking forward to participating in the rest of the conversation today. And thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Nick. I was slow on the unmute today. It's really exciting to hear about the administration's interests and commitment to green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, as well as the examples you highlighted from the region. For those of you in the audience, please do put your questions for Nick and all our presenters in that Q&A box. So next up, we have John Rosem, who is a coastal resilience planning specialist on contract with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. John has over 25 years of experience working with communities on nature-based solutions. Welcome, John.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Now let me try the magic of sharing a screen. Let's see if I have that kind of talent. Okay, should be up and running, hopefully. And thank you. Okay, excellent. Thank you everyone for coming. I think Nick gave a great overview of green infrastructure practices and what's going on today. I certainly learned something from that. And what I'd like to cover for the next few minutes here is some work that we've been doing with a specific office within NOAA, which is the Office for Coastal Management, and trying to implement these practices, and particularly looking at from the lens of community resilience and trying to address some of the elements there. I'm a regional staff member of this office, so I am based in Oakland, California. My presentation will mostly focus on the West Coast. However, I would point out that we're obviously a national office, and so we have folks in all of the regions working on these issues. So certainly, as Nick pointed out, NOAA is sort of very invested in partnerships, and much of the work we do is in partnership with a lot of our sister agencies, whether it's EPA, FEMA, the Corps of Engineers, the Highway Administration. There are many partnerships we do on the federal level, but as well on the state and local level as well. And I'll be talking about some of those in a minute. But these partnerships are really key in trying to get this work really done and put in the ground. So I just want to acknowledge everyone who's working in this space. It really does take an entire nation to get these projects done. Our office in particular, its primary sort of mandate is to implement the Coastal Zone Management Act. And we do that working in partnership with a lot of state agencies in particular. Certainly through the National Coastal Zone Management Program, we work with the state coastal management programs to do that work. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System is our place-based systems, 30 of those throughout the country that do work in science, management, education, and training through those place-based systems. The Coral Reef Conservation Program works on coral reef conservation and implements really a broad spectrum of programs from education through science and research. But this last one, this Digital Coast partnership, is the one that I'm going to focus the rest of the time on. The Digital Coast Partnership is indeed a partnership of many organizations. These are primarily organizations that have managed, whose members work at the coastal, on the coastal fringe, if you will, and make decisions on coastal management. So these are people from, for example, the American Planning Association, the American States for Floodplain Managers, the Coastal States Organization, National Association of Counties, the Nature Conservancy, and others. All of these have really critical decision-making and interests in what goes on at the coast. We've all partnered together, put together a series of resources to help all of us do our work on the coast. And this is really what this Digital Coast website is about. The website itself has lots of information. As you can see, there's over 70 terabytes of data there. both LiDAR, land cover, digital elevation, ortho imagery, a lot of information there that can get in the raw form and obtain. But there are also tools there, about over 50 decision support and visualization tools that help you use that data and better interpret some of that information. And then we also provide to our learning services programs training, and these are anything from instructor-led trainings, online trainings, case studies, publications, videos, webinars, sort of a whole series of things. And then certainly through our regional offices and through headquarters, we also provide technical assistance on coastal issues. So these are sort of the elements that we work on. Focusing primarily on nature-based solutions here, I was just going to highlight a few of these. This is a tool we developed really in response from our partners on trying to better address and document the effectiveness of green infrastructure practices in dealing with hazards. And so this is a database really of sources. They include peer-reviewed journals, online tools, gray literature as well, that look particularly at this question of how effective are these in dealing with the hazards. You can go to this database, you can search by green infrastructure type, hazards or hazard type, you can look at regions or states, really many ways to search this to be able to provide you with some basic information around those things. We have broadened the scope more recently to include economic information, and this is really to help people in their efforts to really apply benefit cost analysis and other things, particularly when applying for funding to get these projects done. We are always looking to expand this. We are right now in the midst of trying to look at the literature around cold regions and how these practices can be applied in more challenging environments. So this is a resource I hope you can take advantage of, and we are constantly working on this. So look for new stuff coming every year. We also have trainings. We provide training specifically on nature-based solutions. I actually am back from one just a couple of weeks ago in Michigan. We have both an online component to these trainings. These generally deal with some of the basic issues. What are some of the basic information you need to know? So what are the practices? How are they applied? What's the basic scientific underpinnings of some of these practices? These are things you can learn on the online element. This is always available and can be shared with partners and others. It's maybe your fellow staff members who want to learn more about it. We also have a part 2, and this is either an in-person element, which where we dive deeper into the strategies around green infrastructure and help you start to develop strategies around local challenges. So this is something that is available and also available from the DigitalCoast website. Another challenge we've heard is around the economics of green infrastructure. And there's been lots of questions about, is this cost effective? How do we price these things, that sort of thing. So our economists on staff have been busy developing a list of training resources. These are both online or self-guided, and they go from anything from the basics to sort of diving into more, what do you need to know in order to interact with an economist to solve economics kind of issues around green infrastructure. They are developing right now a benefit cost analysis module that will be useful in particularly in several of the applications that you need to do for funding and several of the funding programs out there. So this is going to be available, I'm told, probably within a month or two. So keep your ear to the ground on that if that is of interest to you. We also have an online, an ongoing series around funding and financing for coastal resilience. And this looks at sort of the wide range of funding and financing issues around nature-based solutions more broadly. So this goes, again, we had the past topics have been things on the basics. We've spotlighted on specific, more innovative practices, things like the environmental impact bonds, working with community development financial institutions, particularly in underserved communities, and trying to build capacity for communities to access funding. We have another one coming up, probably later this fall, that'll be focusing on stormwater utilities as a funding mechanism for these practices. So keep in touch on that. This is, as I say, an ongoing series. Nick talked about these just a moment ago, and I will jump through this relatively quickly, but I would say that other than to say that it is worth connecting with state coastal management agencies and the National Ash Stream Research Reserves, as some of this funding will be coming through those programs. And so I would say having a good partnership with these folks is probably not a bad idea if you're interested in thinking how maybe some of these funds could get applied. And again, the National Coastal Resilience Fund, this is a partnership with the National Fish and Wildlife Fund. It's administered by them. Last year, and really for the last several years, we've had around $30–40 million annually funded projects. And this is increasing significantly this year, I'm told, up to about 140 million or so. So this is another great funding source for nature-based solutions. Finally, I want to just touch on a few case studies here. We have case studies on Digital Coast that you can access, and I'm just going to highlight a few. This first one is looking down in Southern California. This is around Encinitas area, the Cardiff Beach area. This is what they affectionately call the Cardiff Dunes. That highway, if you can see in the back in that upper left picture, is Pacific Coast Highway. That's Highway 101, a major thoroughfare. It was becoming imperiled by flooding, so they needed to do something. The city needed to do something at this juncture. So they have worked with one of our coastal management agencies here in California, the State Coastal Conservancy, to develop this dune system that protects this highway and also provides access to the beach, as well as providing habitat. So this is a fairly innovative project. It was a lot of lessons learned from this. One is that they were able to reuse a lot of material. The sand that was used for this project was actually dredged just north of this, where these pictures are taken, to keep a lagoon mouth open. So this is an annual thing they do. So they have sort of a source of sand, so they're able to use that here. They also plan this with a sense that there's a time limit here. That this, given the rate of sea level rise, this does have a sort of a lifespan. So they understand that, up to around 2100 or so, this should provide plenty of protection for that highway. But after that, they're going to need to be looking for another solution. And hopefully that buys them time to think about what they can do around the highway and other elements. I just mentioned this because this is, I think, a key element of our coastal work, is that a lot of these nature-based solutions have to be thinking about how they're going to evolve over time. This is another project going way up on the other side, up to where Nick, towards where Nick is sitting, up in Alaska. This is a project we did with in partnership with Alaska Sea Grant and the Chesapeake Bay National Ash Stream Research Reserve. They hosted the trainings in those areas, and from those trainings, they really ran from those things and started doing a ton of work. There's, in the city of Homer, has totally redone their stormwater management elements of their planning documents. They're put in demonstration projects and are now really looking at larger scale infiltration projects that can really reduce particularly coastal erosion in the area. So they've really taken, it's sort of a great case study of them taking something and really starting to apply it and moving through the steps. We have new case studies coming up. One in Oregon looking at rolling revet, what they call rolling revetments. This are dynamic revetments. And these look at is a way of sort of dealing with high energy environments in being able to deal with those environments and protect the beaches as well. So this is a case study we hope to have out in the next several months. And then finally, we have a case study out of California. This is down the San Francisco Bay Area, the Indian Basin Shoreline Park. This is a project, a partnership really between the Trust for Public Land, the City of San Francisco Recreation Department, as well as local organizations. And this is an effort particularly looking at anti-displacement and equity issues around park development, and some of the sort of the downsides of doing some of this work is that it tends to price out existing residents. So this is these partners really have worked hard in trying to reduce that element and working very closely with the community. So that should be documented in this case study, and again, should be coming up by the end of the year. So if you want to find out more, you can go to our, again, the Digital Coast website. We have a topics page. You can find everything I talked about there, plus much more. And with that, I thank you, Rebecca, and I'm pass it back to you.
John, thank you. It's really cool to hear about the Digital Coast trainings and these projects. So really appreciate you sharing. There are actually a couple of questions for you specifically about NOAA's efforts. So if you want to type those answers out, that's probably pretty easy for you if you don't mind.
I will do it. Thank you.
So next up, we have Christina Toms, an ecological engineer with 20 years of experience working at the interface between applied science, engineering, and policy development to support ecosystem restoration and multi-benefit climate change adaptation in aquatic ecosystems. She currently serves as the climate change lead at the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board. Welcome, Christina.
Hi, everyone, and thanks to the EPI Center for the opportunity to connect with these fabulous speakers and engage with you all today. My name is Christina Toms, and I'm an ecological engineer at the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board, a division of the California Environmental Protection Agency. I'm excited to share what we and our partners are doing to support the planning, design, and implementation of nature-based climate change adaptation along the Bay Area's coastlines. Before I dive into that, I'd like to briefly introduce what the San Francisco Bay Water Board is and what we do. We're one of 9 regional water boards in California charged with enforcing the Federal Clean Water Act, as well as California's Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act, which actually predates and inspired the federal law. The map on the right displays our jurisdiction, which includes all of San Francisco Bay, the Pacific coastline along Marin County, the city of San Francisco, and most of San Mateo County, and the contributing watersheds to each. Our responsibilities include establishing beneficial uses of the region's waters, including wetlands, developing plans to maintain and improve beneficial uses in water quality, including plans for climate adaptation, regulating dredge and fill in waters and wetlands, the discharge of wastewater and stormwater, and the cleanup of polluted sites, and funding regional monitoring of the bay, its tributaries, and nearshore habitats. We support climate change adaptation in the region through an approach that centers equity and emphasizes science, collaboration, and policies. Effective climate adaptation requires decision-making that is guided by the best available science. It requires collaboration across agencies, jurisdictions, and technical disciplines. And it must be implemented through policies that incentivize and permit innovative projects and programs. Collectively, these elements are the foundation of good projects that improve the health and resilience of our built and natural communities. I emphasize good projects because in a time when so many leaders emphasize the need to cut the green tape, it can be tempting to think that any climate adaptation project is a worthy one. But in my 20 years as both a practitioner and a regulator, I found that the most effective way to cut the green tape is to propose thoughtfully designed projects that directly address each of these elements. Next, I'll briefly describe what the Water Board is doing in each of these spheres. First, science. We can't develop effective adaptation strategies without a fundamental understanding of the physical and ecological processes that govern the condition and distribution of the region's waters, and how these are in turn affected by climate change, habitat restoration and adaptation projects, our regulatory programs, development, water operations, and related drivers. For these reasons, the Water Board helps lead 2 regional monitoring programs, the San Francisco Bay Regional Monitoring Program, or Bay RMP, and the Wetland Regional Monitoring Program, or WRMP. Founded in 1993, the Bay RMP monitors basic water quality parameters, pollutants such as nutrients and emerging contaminants, and key climate resources such as estuarine and fluvial sediment. The WRMP is a newer program modeled on the Bay RMP that's developing regional science to inform key information needs, such as where tidal wetlands are and aren't keeping pace with rising sea levels, and where intervention may be necessary to help these wetlands persist into the future. Both programs are supported by a coalition of federal, state, local, and NGO partners that ensures the relevance, credibility, and utility of their science. The Water Board helps to translate this science into regional climate adaptation frameworks for use by the region's decision makers, such as planners, engineers, regulators, and implementers. Starting from the upper left and moving clockwise, the California Sea Level Rise Guidance, Baylands Ecosystem Habitat Goals Update, Sediment for Survival Strategy, New Life for Eroding Shorelines Report, and San Francisco Bay Shoreline Adaptation Atlas are examples of key science frameworks that help support good projects in the region. I want to highlight the Adaptation Atlas, developed by the San Francisco Estuary Institute and urban planning nonprofit SPUR with funding from the Water Board. One of the fundamental challenges of climate adaptation planning in San Francisco Bay is the complex and varied nature of the Bay Shore, which includes 9 counties, 101 cities, multiple special districts, and a spectrum of overlapping regulatory jurisdictions. However, the effects of climate change don't stop at any of these boundaries. To build social and ecological resilience to climate change, a science-based framework is essential to identify effective adaptation strategies that are appropriate for their particular settings and take advantage of natural processes. The Adaptation Atlas does just that by classifying the Bay shoreline into 30 operational landscape units, or OLUs, that share key characteristics such as shoreline morphology, tide range and wave exposure, and development patterns. Smaller than a county, but bigger than a city, OLUs provide an opportunity to plan effective climate adaptation across multiple jurisdictions. The Adaptation Atlas then pairs each OLU with a suite of appropriate nature-based solutions, such as beaches, tidal wetlands, and nearshore reefs, as well as regulatory, financial, and policy tools to address the built environment. Moving on to collaborations. Climate change is a novel challenge that we can most effectively address through collective action. Thankfully, the Bay Area has a muscle memory for institutional collaboration, due in large part to the efforts of the Water Board and its partners to support an ecologically, socially, and economically thriving Bay Area. We're therefore engaged in multiple collaborative planning efforts to help build a climate-resilient future for the region, including those shown here that are focused on land use, transportation, wastewater and stormwater management, flood control, and habitat restoration. These collaborations typically involve a range of federal, state, and local agencies, universities and research institutions, and NGOs. Another key collaboration is our participation in the San Francisco Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, or BRIT. The BRIT is a team of dedicated funded staff from the 6 state and federal regulatory agencies with jurisdiction over wetland restoration and shoreline protection projects in San Francisco Bay: the Water Board, Army Corps of Engineers, Bay Conservation and Development Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and NOAA Fisheries. The purpose of the BRIT is to efficiently coordinate the planning, review, and permitting for multi-benefit tidal wetland restoration and shoreline protection projects, including but not limited to those funded by the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. The third key element of our climate change adaptation approach is making sure that our policies are climate ready. The Water Quality Control Plan for the San Francisco Bay Basin, or Basin Plan, is the Water Board's master water quality control planning document. However, the Basin Plan currently lacks any description of climate change and its relevance to our regulatory programs, particularly dredge or fill activities in and near the region's shorelines. We're therefore amending the Basin Plan with a new section on climate change and aquatic habitat protection, management, and restoration. This section proposes a series of questions for permit applicants and Water Board staff that asks if proposed coastal projects are based on the best available science, developed as part of a phased adaptation strategy, developed within a landscape scale planning framework, based on practicable nature-based solutions, and developed with consideration of near and long-term direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts from the project and climate change. The Basin Plan Amendment emphasizes nature-based approaches and hybrid measures that integrate nature with engineered structural approaches because they can help create resilient shorelines that support co-benefits such as recreation, water quality improvement, and habitat for native species, and result in fewer cumulative impacts than projects that rely solely on gray infrastructure. The amendment highlights nature-based approaches such as living shorelines, including projects to establish oyster and eelgrass habitat, beach creation, enhancement and restoration, wetland protection, enhancement and restoration, estuary watershed reconnection, in which flood control channels and creeks are reconnected to baylands, strategic sediment placement, in which dredged sediment is beneficially reused to help bayland habitats maintain elevation relative to rising sea levels, gradually sloped ecotone levees and wastewater seepage or horizontal levees that beneficially reuse treated wastewater to recreate freshwater and brackish marshes around the bay margins, and migration space preparation that facilitates the long-term sea level rise driven transgression of estuarine wetland habitats over adjacent uplands. Finally, I want to talk about our efforts to center equity in climate change adaptation. In 2020, the State Water Resources Control Board, our mothership in Sacramento, passed a resolution condemning racism, xenophobia, bigotry, and racial injustice, and strengthening our commitment to racial equity, diversity, inclusion, access, and anti-racism. We're working towards a future where we equitably implement our mission to preserve, protect, and restore drinking water and water resources for all Californians, and where race no longer predicts the access to or quality of water resources a person receives. Race is not a predictor of professional outcomes for our employees, and we consistently apply a racial equity lens to our decision-making processes. At the San Francisco Bay Water Board, we're applying these principles to our climate adaptation work in a number of ways. We're working with frontline communities to address their intersecting environmental justice concerns, such as flood vulnerability, the impact of rising groundwater levels on contaminated sites, air pollution, and limited access to urban green spaces. For example, the WRMP is establishing a new People and Wetlands Working Group that will integrate the priorities of frontline communities into our wetland science framework. New faces of the Adaptation Atlas are developing phased adaptation strategies for EJ-impacted communities. We are also engaging with local tribes to better understand how we can support their cultural, spiritual, ceremonial, subsistence, and/or traditional practices. For example, we are working with tribes to include tribal beneficial uses of waters, such as cultural uses and subsistence fishing, into our basin plan. Again, thank you for the opportunity to talk about how we develop good nature-based climate change adaptation projects by centering equity and emphasizing science, collaboration, and policies. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like to discuss any of the projects or programs I mentioned today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Christina. It's great to hear about the good projects that are happening around the San Francisco Bay. And also those tools and resources you all have developed. So much appreciated there. Next up, I'm pleased to introduce Tracy Tackett for our final presentation today. Tracy is the Drainage and Wastewater Capital Portfolio Manager for Seattle Public Utilities. She brings over 20 years of experience to the role, where she sets the strategic direction for DWW's capital improvement program, which focuses on achieving public health and safety outcomes while reducing the effects of Seattle's urban stormwater runoff on urban creeks, lakes, and Puget Sound. We're excited to hear about the work you've been leading, so welcome.
Happy to be here. All right. So I'm going to bring us up into the upper watershed. So a lot of the work we've been talking about is nature-based solutions down on the shoreline. And although Seattle does also have some work around there, I'm going to talk more about the upland aspects of using green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And with that, I'm going to start a little bit with the why and then move into the what. And next slide, please, Rebecca. So a little bit about Seattle Public Utilities, just for grounding. We are 4 lines of business. So stormwater and wastewater is the world that I am in and spend my time focused on. But we are also a drinking water utility, which I'll touch on a little bit later, but gives us that opportunity to really think about holistic solutions and one water principles. We're also a solid waste utility, so waste reduction is also very important in our life cycle processes of trying to keep waste keeping food products and other waste out of the stream. Okay, next slide. So just a little bit of grounding. So why in the stormwater and wastewater system, what are some of the needs that we have? Because we've been talking so much about it down at the shoreline side, just a little grounding. In the upper watershed and the impacts of stormwater, really we come down to 2 major foundational root causes. One is that there's just too much runoff. Our urban areas have sometimes been designed with smaller conveyance infrastructure for the way things were 50 years ago when there was less impervious surface and or lower rainfall intensities, as we're finding with climate impacts in our region. So a lot of it is about too much runoff for what the system has available to move it to downstream environment. The other aspect is too much pollution. As we get more and more humans in an area, there is more and more cars, more and more roadways. And so that cumulative impact of the pollutants, you know, the fertilizers that we use in our, well, some people use, not me, on our lawns. And so what is that impact and how does it hurt our iconic species and the environment that we're trying to protect? And that picture on to the right is actually of some of our salmon and showing some of our pre-spawning mortality that we've been finding, which has been directly attributed to some of the products in brakes in cars. And so it's just an example of the science is narrowing in on telling us what are causing some of the problems and now how are we going to address them. Next slide, please. And this one is, you know, these are the flooding and the water quality are sometimes very highly interconnected. And so the picture on the left is an example of very extreme rains, and you know that could have an impact on some of the pollutants that are on existing properties and how they move into the water body. So some of these problems are interconnected, the data shows on the right-hand side regionally, and this is probably true nationally, the biggest pollutant sources and impacts on our water bodies, again, are car-based, and it's about the petroleum. So a lot of our focus is on how do we deal with pollutants from the roadway. So that's a little bit of the why. And now next slide, I'll start to get into a little bit of where we're moving forward. Why on the stormwater side. Our origin of our programs, and I'm going to spend a lot of time moving into our green infrastructure program, but our origin of the program was in the foundational environmental impacts about stream health and the too much water and the water quality pollutants. And now we are learning with more science and more attention to the bigger holistic problems of the city. There's also a lot of other science and data that we need to bring into our life. And one of them is this horrible finding that has been assessed that our impacts are not universal in health equity. And so we have parts of our city where the pollutants have resulted in a 13-year, conditions in this geographic area have resulted in a 13-year lower life expectancy than in some of the more affluent portions of our watershed. And so that's an example of us as a utility broadening our aperture to think about what are some of the other health-based impacts that we should be considering as we work on our solution set. Sorry, I was looking over at my notes on the other side. Next slide, please. I could go into some science and data about all of the different pressures, and that's what we've been working on through our 50-year planning effort, an effort called Shape Our Water. What are our projected impacts coming to us through climate change? What is our risk and uncertainty around earthquakes? Where are we really seeing the highest impacts from environmental justice? So each one of these areas are areas that the data is continuing to grow, and what as a whole is an understanding that we need to think about how we solve problems differently. And so this is all a little bit on the what and why, sorry, the why, and how are we going about this, about our thinking and our utility and how we're shifting that. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So this is, I'd say, the progression of at least our utility, but I'd go so far as to say the engineering community nationwide. I'm an engineer. We come from a background of like, what is our role? What is the problem I'm trying to solve? And kind of a single purpose, siloed, we're technical and I'm going to solve this problem and I'm going to use my expertise and I'm going to do it the most cost efficiently. And so that is the charge that we used to be given as utilities. And now to the next slide. Given all of the information that we're finding about the inequities around our multiple problems, around the reality that we are very limited for space and we need to figure out how to partner together, we're finding that our role is much messier and much more complicated. And so, yes, we are technical, but we also need to consider in the economic factors and the social cultural factors and the history and the impacts to our Native American community from long before we came in to solve this drainage problem. As we're solving our technical problems, we need to address past and present conditions. So our bubble has gotten a lot bigger, and these are the things that we are challenging ourselves in Seattle Public Utilities, and I see our national cohorts, and I bet most of the people on this call are also challenging themselves. So with that, maybe the next slide. As we've been challenging ourselves, how are we growing? And so this brings us to our green infrastructure program and how we have an initiative to continue to grow that program. And I'll share a little bit of, we've been working on it for over 20 years, and it's continually evolving and growing our ability to deliver more for our ratepayers. And so we have all these flooding problems and the water quality problems. We have our regulatory requirements, and we are continuing to figure out how can we address all those core system needs while also addressing health benefits for our community and ecological benefits for our community, and just overall optimizing our value for the cost of our ratepayers. Next slide, please. So we have 20 plus years of putting projects in the ground, and I wanted to just give a sense of what some of those examples are, some of the bright spots that others could learn from and pull from. And I'll put in the chat after I'm done talking. There's a national cohort for green infrastructure, the Green Infrastructure Exchange, that shares best practices. And so, all the details and specs and the guidance documents is on that organization's website. So any local jurisdiction who is trying to get into this and wanting support and the best information, I recommend you go straight to there. And then from the political side, US Water Alliance is really the best as a source for kind of the upper level speaking points and the rationale on why we need to solve things holistically. So I'll put some links into both of those. But for like, what are the solutions? We really need solutions across all scales of our watershed. And so this is some of the types of approaches that we have. So in the very upper watershed, retrofits to existing spaces on private lands. That's like a, parcel by parcel. 60% of Seattle is it's privately owned land. So you need to work on the existing impervious areas. Then in the kind of next column, center column, is our right-of-way infrastructure. And we have a lot of opportunities in our right-of-ways to really target those pollutants that are in our, coming from our tires and our brakes. And so how can we and just the leaking gas and all the other things that come with our cars. So how can we grab the pollutants off of the roadways and bring it into our drainage conveyance infrastructure that also can slow the water down and treat the water? And that's our right-of-way bioretention. We call that a natural drainage system program. And we have all kinds of projects in that kind of genre. And then we're moving into more on the right-hand side as we're going into more of that multiple benefits. How do we have floodable stormwater parks? And so we have a couple large-scale examples for, you know, the 5-year, 25-year, 100-year storm, and how can you have parkland that you allow to inundate at those really high intensities that we're getting more of with climate impacts, and then have it be a functional park space during the smaller storms. Or down in our creek watersheds, how do we reconnect our floodplains and really work more on that natural hydrologic regime, and having, you know, one of the fun things in our science, one of our great scientists in our floodplain projects has a whole hypereal zone design approach on how to really connect those interstitial spaces for the habitat, and has been doing great monitoring and finding great success on the design approaches that they've implemented. So a whole lot of tools in the toolbox of where, and the shapes and sizes of what is green infrastructure and nature-based strategies are a whole host of nature oriented, but also rainwater harvesting, and I don't have any pictures of rainwater harvesting because it's underground, and uses of permeable pavement whenever you have hard space needs for vehicles or bikes. So those are some of the tools in our toolbox. Maybe next slide. This is a little bit of, you know, on the bottom bar, just kind of the trajectory of where we've all been and where we're going. You know, the Pacific Northwest was heavily landscaped, and then with time that landscaping was cut down and converted to impervious surfaces. Really what we're all trying to do with these nature-based strategies is make our uplands function more like the forested environment that used to be here. So just returning our hydrologic regime back towards what it used to be. And we've been using a host of pilots and programs and long-term monitoring to show effectiveness and bringing that data into how we change our designs and approaches. And again, same with lots of other parts across utilities across the country, so that green infrastructure exchange best practices really builds in a lot of the science on how do you design properly. Okay, next slide. I'm gonna dive in. So this is just to say we have a lot of projects. And so some of them are from small scale of just at a single family home and a cistern, all the way up to, you know, some of those big floodable parks or large scale right-of-way projects that I showed. And it takes a lot of small interventions to add up to the whole. So that's a little bit of what's different in the nature-based strategies, like the distributed infrastructure strategies versus some of the more centralized single purpose strategies. So in the combined sewer overflow world that I spend some of my time in, people are kind of used to one big old tank or tunnel to do everything, whereas when we're using the nature-based strategies, we're doing, you know, some of that work that I showed earlier on private land. We're doing programs where we're incentivizing homeowners, we're doing work in the right-of-way, we're doing work with our parks department. You know, we're kind of, it's a whole host of lots of projects together to add up to the whole that we're seeking. And it's also not like one and done that the project's built and we're in compliance. It's a long-term strategy and it's adaptive. And so that's, the adaptability is great with respect to the climate impacts on our rainfall, because we don't quite know what the future will be. So we can add in more as needed. We don't have to pre-design it all. So it lends itself to that, but it's also, you know, back to a shift for formerly standard practices. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, there it is. Okay, so I just wanted to hit, so all of this work I mentioned, I think space is limited and we can't work in a silo by ourselves. So we really need to work holistically with our other city departments. You know, so I work with, or my team works with our transportation department on how can we align pedestrian improvement needs with our drainage improvement needs. We work with our parks department on looking for opportunities for that floodable open space. We work with, so those are ones that are in that far left column of utility-led projects. How do we, when we have a problem we need to solve, how do we work with our city family to implement those problems? Then our next way of delivering is working with the private landowners, and that's through so partner-led projects, meaning it's somebody else's land and they are initiating the project, and how do we partner with them? That is our that is the most cost-effective point to be working on projects, is when somebody else is initiating, and how do you add more to the project. So I just want to highlight the need for those kind of strategies for all of us. And again, not kind of the traditional way utilities work, but an important way for utilities to work. So we have a couple different pathways. One is rebates. Sometimes we have a couple different rebate programs, and I'll put in the link a case study on our Rainwise program that I don't know, it summarizes it pretty well. We have direct partnerships with more progressive developers that want to go beyond stormwater code and do more stormwater management than they're required, and how can we help financially partner that. And then our newest iteration, we're in the process of developing a performance-based contract, and that includes the funding and the financing of a third-party organization, third-party leading retrofit throughout the city. And so we pay for the outcomes, and that allows a group that has a lot of depth to be able to add in some of the other performance outcomes that we're interested in, like developing a jobs program for working with at-risk youth to bring them into the job market and implement the construction, the design and the construction of projects. It allows us to work with community-based organizations to help them further what their goals are for their land and their community, and make a project that is more than just the stormwater parts. And I think I have a couple examples of that, so why don't you go to the next slide. But that performance-based contract has an alternative funding and financing approach that we can get into in the question and answer. So I wanted to share a little bit about it. So this slide is an example of some of those, what we would visualize the community defining as their priority and coming into this performance-based contract. And it's similar to what we could do as a utility on our own, but it needs a large, working with partners takes a lot of time, and really not everybody likes working directly with government. And so we want to work with the trusted community partners and enable them to work directly with their community. And so this is a way to be really clear on the outcomes that we can fund as a stormwater agency, and have the community groups and the third parties look for stacked funding. So like, okay, here's the piece that's going to come from the utility. Here's the piece that's going to come from a workforce program piece, meaning funding piece. So stacked funding mechanisms so that whole projects can be delivered. And I think that might be my last slide, but let's look. Oh yeah, so back to decision frameworks and how do we really have good projects. This is, as we are initiating how we solve our problems, and we are looking, how can we have those good projects, and what is that framework for how we identify what is a good project. And these are all the lenses that we are trying to look through as we are working to leverage our utility dollars for the best outcomes at the most affordable point for our customers. There's a lot to think about, and so we have a framework that is helping us decide what is a good project and bring those conversations forward. And with that, that's my high level of all the things we're up to. I'll drop some links in the chat of some good resources.
Thank you, Tracy. It's very helpful to hear about how Seattle Public Utilities is thinking about many factors impacting communities, how green infrastructure is part of that, and the real collaborative effort. So I'm going to welcome all of the speakers to join us. And as that's happening, we're actually going to launch a poll. So we have some questions for the audience. So if you want to go ahead and start the poll. We have two questions for you. The first is, what types of case studies and examples would you like to see that highlight green infrastructure and nature-based solutions? For this one, you can pick multiple options. So federal and state collaborations, municipal, GSI, partnerships between universities, NGOs, and communities, coordinating funding from multiple sources, workforce development, long-term operations and maintenance, green infrastructure, and environmental justice. Our second question is related to your region, this region, actually, not the region that you're living in, but the West Coast, Pacific Northwest. What do you consider to be the dominant hazard in the West Coast and Pacific Northwest region that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions need to address? For this one, you get to pick just one. So drought, wildfire, extreme heat, flooding, coastal resilience, risk of tsunamis. So go ahead and answer those questions. And then we'll share the results. Thank you. So you all can see these, and we will share these with you in that follow-up email. But it does look like people want to see more about municipal green stormwater infrastructure, long-term operations and maintenance, green infrastructure and environmental justice. So really helpful to hear. And we can talk a little bit more about these topics as we go into the Q&A. And then the dominant hazard along the West Coast. So we see drought, which is not so surprising knowing what happens out there. So thank you all for participating, really helpful to get your feedback. What we'll do now is go into the Q&A with our experts here. So first I want to thank you all for your wonderful presentations and examples of how green infrastructure and nature-based solutions are addressing needs around the West. So I'm going to kick it off with our first question. Actually, I will do one thing first. I will encourage all of the participants to put your questions in the Q&A. We have a couple in there, but it would be great to have a few more for our speakers from you all. We want to hear what your questions are. So now I'll start with my question, or a question that I think we'd all be interested in. So what do you all think are some of the major hazards that communities are addressing with green infrastructure and nature-based solutions? And what does resilience look like for communities in this region? John, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, why not? So what are some of the hazards we're dealing with? I think, we're dealing with them all, to be honest, but certainly with NOAA's focus, I mean, we have a pretty key focus on the coast. And our biggest challenges here are really the high energy environments on the coast. I'd say that's one of the ones we're really quite focused on and trying to figure out how to deal with some of these things, as well as flooding coming from the highlands. So, the coast is a hard place to work because you get energy from both directions, right? So it makes it a very, very challenging place to work. So I think, Tracy's and Christina's points on the upland works is as important as what's going on directly on the coast. So, the hazards we're dealing with are clearly flooding, storm surge, wave runout, those elements, and particularly how they're affecting infrastructure that's been placed in harm's way through historic practices primarily. So those would be mine. I'm going to pass it to my esteemed colleagues, however.
Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to build on that too, just in terms of what does resilience look like? And we're talking about this a lot in the context of hazards and resilience to different hazards. But one of the ways we're thinking about resilience is that it's really more cross-cutting than that. Like we need to build resilience against these specific hazards that are being exacerbated by climate change, but also above and beyond that, resilience in our health and our livelihoods and ecosystems, food security. And so particularly up here in Alaska, whenever we're thinking about the role of a nature-based solution or a green infrastructure project, we're thinking about the co-benefits that it can deliver. to both protecting people from harm, protecting infrastructure and resources from harm, but also actually growing the resilience of a community or a local economy and how that can expand out. So it's certainly nice when we have projects that can do all of that. And that's why it's so wonderful to bring so many different minds together. But there's also areas where we really struggle with bringing green infrastructure projects to the issue. And I think a key area that in the region that I work in is with the loss of permafrost and nearshore sea ice. You can't really just put permafrost back in the ground as a nature, but you can't go dig it up and put it back in. And so there's some really great communities that focus in, communities of practice that have been focusing in on these regional questions. And like there's a Canadian and US and Great Lakes team that's working on cold climate solutions, which I think John may have mentioned as well. So I think it just highlights to me the importance of thinking locally in development of projects and working together with, as was mentioned, the community serving organizations that can help be a connection point for the design of a project that'll really deliver to at the most local level.
Yeah, and there was a related question that said, are there local community-based organizations that have been leading in these types of projects? And do you see more of a role for these local community-based organizations to do that work? I think yes is to the latter, but for the first one, are there any groups that people would like to share or talk a little bit about?
I can start. I don't think there's like one organization that's across the whole Northwest region that I would want to point people to, because these are very locally based and what is the right thing for that community. And I've seen some really great projects where, community wants a specific outcome. Like there's one down in Tacoma where they wanted a community garden. And so the community wanted a place to grow local food, which makes them more resilient. It gives them, a connection to their roots of being able, literally roots, of being able to grow their local food supply. That can be an expensive project for the community to take on. And they worked with some stacked funding of trying to find, well, what are the different pieces that people can bring together? And one of them was the local utility was willing to fund the stormwater management. And that gave them a very large rainwater harvesting system that could then irrigate the garden. And that, being able to spend that money on the rainwater harvesting was enough of tipping them over for the other grants that they were able to combine together to be able to put the food and the stormwater together into being a what we call a whole project defined by the community. I've seen lots of examples like that across the country. There's a lot of great examples of schoolyard retrofits on the East Coast that probably others have talked about with the Trust for Public Lands, and how do you have schoolyards be revitalized to be more active play space for the local youth, but also a lot of times they can be designed to add that resilience in for the stormwater, and that gives some of that nexus with regulatory needs and therefore stormwater funding and also workforce development. And so anyway, those kind of partnerships are great.
And I would just jump in. One thing that we picked up from working with the India Basin Project here in San Francisco Bay is the importance of paying people for their expertise. And I think oftentimes we bring community groups together and, we have our consultants and we have all these people that we're paying pretty good dollars for. And then we have the public come in and expect them to give them their expertise for free. And I think we have to acknowledge that is valuable and needs to be paid for.
Yes. Fair and excellent point. Clark, did you want to jump in there too?
Yeah, I just want to jump in on Tracy has been using a terminology that, we're trying to explore more of at the federal level, just given the multiple amounts of funding available, and that's this project stacking. And as feds, you know, there's these silos of funding available for, as you say, like single-use purposes, but you know, and everyone's got a lot of, well, I shouldn't say everyone's got a lot of fun, but there's funding out there as evidenced by the compendium that Nick talked about, and on the Fed Collaborative, you'll see a summary sheet of lot. So I'm wondering if maybe Christina or Tracy, if there's like any insight you can give us on how maybe as feds we reframe this when we discuss funding for nature-based or green infrastructure, to just be cognizant of like breaking down the silos and getting to these things that apparently some community groups can do, but how can we facilitate that?
I think that's a great question. And I really appreciate the resources that John pointed to that NOAA's developing regarding project financing. I know, you know, my technical expertise is in coastal ecosystem restoration design, right? It's not infrastructure finance. And I'm finding that particularly the more that I work with, you know, municipal leaders and elected leaders, that's a whole other universe that if it's a mystery to me, you know, it's certainly, you know, it's a mystery to a lot of people. And so I think, you know, helping folks understand how they can engage in those processes. How do you get from point A to point B, from knowing that you've got an area and a community that needs some multi-benefit projects that can tap into streams of funding related to infrastructure, related to resilience, related to biodiversity, and figuring out how to weave those threads into a coherent project funding and implementation plan. I think we might touch upon that in some other questions here, but I think that's really important for decision makers at the community level, for decision makers at the regulatory level. We certainly have folks coming to us often saying, "Hey, Water Board, you know, could you help us with this?" And when it comes to the financing side, I think we all could do a better job understanding how to make that happen.
Maybe I'll add on to that. I think it's us all stepping out of our silo. So in the past, I've had our team put together great materials about what our RainWise program is, and you know, and like how you can get incentives about it. But now what we're trying to put a focus on is like, okay, let's put on the lens of a community group who wants a new park. What are all the funding sources? And we are only one of them. And can we put guidance from their hat as opposed to from my hat? And that, you know, our initial thought was like, wait, but that's, you know, that's not, that we're not in control of all those other funding sources. But it's, you know, if we want people to do these better projects and we want to help be part of that, we're, you know, we are the ones who can take that first step. So I think, Clark, like, I don't know, you know, that would be great on a federal level. What are funding sources that are good to stack together? What looks like, you know, here, let's start from a place of, you know, of food forest, and what are all the different kind of funding that might work for that. I did put in the link, one of the ones of the health benefits from green infrastructure, and the Willamette Partnership was trying to work on that a while back of like, what are some examples of stacked funding sources? And anyway, I think for all of us to try to create some local collateral for community, but from their lens, not from our lenses.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Thanks. I would just emphasize also the real opportunity with the infrastructure investments to make these co-investments in natural solutions and green infrastructure, because lots of times the funding models and the programs are set up to really fund that gray traditional infrastructure. And it just takes someone reaching out early in the process, talking with someone at a local meeting, and having those advocacy conversations about, hey, have you thought of this? Opening up that box and just sparking people's creativity. If you get that in, though, if you have those conversations early, there's a lot of places to go, a lot of directions, and a lot of support in the funding that's out there to not only fund those works, but elevate them to the top of funding lists because they have those dual elements. And one of the other things that we see in the co-benefit side is just the continuing value of some projects that are outside of what we might traditionally think of. So I mentioned that at the start of the call, that project up in Shaktoolik that built that berm. So it was a project that was funded to develop a coastal berm for flood protection. But as part of that project, the community was also making investments in heavy equipment to construct the berm that then is also benefiting residents for cleanup activities or regular routine maintenance. And so there's all these ways in which these investments can have multiple benefits that we don't always think of sometimes, even at the outset. And so just having those early conversations and being someone in the room that's thinking about this when infrastructure is being discussed and bringing those conversations up can be so incredibly valuable.
Yeah, and a little bit of a follow, I have so many follow-ons to it, but I'm going to go in one direction, which is, you know, how are some of these co-benefits, the environmental, health, social, and economic benefits from green infrastructure and nature-based solutions leveraged to support frontline communities? And then a question from the audience related to that is, what are some of the equity indicators that are used for these projects to ensure people are centered in some way, the way that nature might be? I don't know if anybody is ready for that.
I can try to tackle that. I think I'll work with the equity indicators. We don't know yet. So at least here, you know, at my agency, and I run the technical advisory committee of the Wetland Regional Monitoring Program. So we're developing the science framework. So that's why we're developing that people in wetlands work group, so that folks can tell us, what are the indicators and metrics that matter to you? What should we be tracking? How can we be incorporating that into our science framework, pursuing funding for it, and bringing everyone into the science enterprise, instead of, you know, acting like this, you know, deus ex machina, here is the science, we hereby present it to you, you are welcome. Really make it a collaborative process. Regarding co-benefits, I think, you know, particularly along, you know, the West Coast of the US, and especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, we're a highly urbanized estuary. And the vast majority of the built environment of our communities are along shorelines, and our urban areas are along shorelines. And I think I feel like if there's one thing that I hope there's a lot of things we've learned from the pandemic, but one of them is that urban access to green space is a key component of mental, physical, social health. And so those coastal areas, you know, that is the green space. That is the most easily accessible green space in urban areas. So recognizing that, you know, we have a tremendously, in most locations, a tremendously engineered landscape that was engineered to accommodate a climate that no longer exists, right? So we have to meet all of these multiple challenges of realigning our transportation and our flood management and our utility infrastructure to allow the built environment to persist in this, you know, radically different climate. We have to do that in a way that facilitates social benefits to urban communities. You know, dealing with issues as like, you know, water resources. You know, flipping between these periods of extreme wetness and extreme dryness, dealing with a eutrophic estuary. We just had a harmful algal bloom in San Francisco Bay that was first reported by folks along the shoreline, and that has had a tremendous, hopefully not too lasting, but a tremendous near-term impact on the ecology of the bay. And, you know, and that matters to people, that matters to our subsistence fishing communities. So I think recognizing that, you know, multi-benefit climate adaptation infrastructure is the path moving forward. We've picked the low-hanging fruit. We've already done the easy ecosystem restoration projects. We've done the warm fuzzy habitat restoration projects. Everything moving forward is going to involve transportation infrastructure, utility infrastructure, flood management infrastructure, water infrastructure. And so we need to be putting all these pieces together and stacking projects, as Tracy says.
I'll add on a little bit, although I don't have a crisp, clear answer. You know, the question was, what are some of our equity indicators? And there is such a long life of projects, and so it's a little bit at different touch points. But I think some of the key ones that are on my mind are, as we are developing projects and project approaches, what are we hearing from community, and are we getting feedback from a population that is representative of the population that we're working? Is our outreach deeply getting to the right people? So how do we how do we ensure that the people we're hearing from are truly the community that's there and representative of the community? That's one of the things that we're paying a lot of attention to on how we build from equity. Then on what we have heard, on the places that we have done that deep in-reach to find out what community needs are, what we hear most frequently in our most at-risk populations are around displacement. So as we are putting in our improvements to make things better, how are we helping ensure that people remain in place? And so that the ability to stay in the location for the project that you advocated for as the community is definitely high on our list on how do we help track that and help make that better. And that is a pretty tough nut to crack. And so one of the ways that we are having our capital projects make sure to have a space there is around local workforce requirements and targets. And so we do have some pretty clear performance metrics around workforce. And for us in Seattle, we're able to, for projects over a certain dollar, make priority hire a requirement, which isn't possible across the country, but it is for our region. And then for those performance-based contracts, we're able to talk about not only number of jobs, but with the performance-based contract, we're also looking at pre and post surveys with the community on, how does the community rate us? And so it's a proxy on how we're doing with equity is like, well, what are you saying about how we're doing? So we don't have it nailed, but we're growing our skills there and keep looking at our Shape Our Water website, because that's what we'll be trying to make transparent our efforts.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm sad to report that we are really coming to the end of this webinar and the series. I do want to quickly launch our last set of poll questions. This is to tell us a little bit about how this webinar went for you, thoughts about it. So please do share. They're quick questions. And as you all are doing that, I just want to thank Nick and Christina and Tracy and John, as well as Clark and Robin from the EPA. All of the regional webinars have been recorded and are posted on the EPICenter webpage for each region. Again, you will receive a link to the recording, the slides, the chat, and really appreciate everyone's participation and expertise, as this has been a learning opportunity for us at the EPICenter, as well as I will say for the folks at the EPA and the White House, and really just sharing some great examples of what's happening. And we know that this is just a start for what great projects are happening around. So really appreciate it. And once you finish with your poll questions, just let us know if you have any questions, and we look forward to seeing you at future EPICenter events, and we'll keep you posted on our work in this space.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care and keep up the good work.